The universe is a brain, and you are just a neuron. The plot lit up on the screen like a heartbeat. A network metric, same slope, same rhythm, bridged a brain slice in the cosmic web. One dataset ruined a career. Another quietly vanished. If these filaments process information, we aren't spectators. We're components. Astronomers mapped the universe and found bones. Neuroscientists mapped the brain and found highways. The analogy should have died as a cute metaphor. It wouldn't. We'll follow the people who chased proof and the pushback that tried to erase it. To understand why this idea kept surviving peer review and ridicule, we need to go back to when the map of the universe first looked alive. Mapping a living skeleton, the birth of the cosmic web. They sliced the sky like a loaf of bread. In 1989, the CFA Redshift survey painted a narrow wedge of the universe, and against a backdrop that should have been randomly sprinkled, patterns emerged: filaments, walls, and yawning voids. It felt wrong, like catching a static photograph mid-breath. You could trace lines with a finger and never hit the end of a structure. One researcher later admitted the first time they saw the CFA slice, they thought of nerves. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, the 2DF Galaxy Redshift Survey and the Sloan Digital Sky Survey filled the wedge into a tapestry. Nodes, massive clusters, sat like junctions. Filaments threaded them together across hundreds of millions of light years. Between them, dark emptiness stretched, voids so large a galaxy could drift for eons and meet nothing. The pattern wasn't an illusion from a narrow view anymore. It was the scaffolding of the cosmos. Here's the tension. Randomness wasn't exactly expected, but the level of structure shocked people who still carried simpler mental models. Gravity clumps matter, sure, but these highways, these bridges stretching like tendons, the picture demanded a better story. Simulations got to work. The Millennium Simulation, then Illustris and Eagle, pulled dark matter and gas forward under gravity and expansion, letting the simple rules run. Out came webs, self-organized, emergent, eerily familiar in their geometry. Nothing mystical, just gravity and time carving lanes into the universe. Meanwhile, a parallel reaction formed in quiet corners of conferences, the metaphor problem. People started seeing neurons in everything. The spiderweb sky slides drew laughs, then unease. Pareidolia, seeing faces in clouds, stalked the conversation. Senior voices warned against metaphors that outrun mechanisms. Neurons fire spikes, galaxies don't. The risk was real. If the field fell in love with a pattern, it could steer entire research agendas into dead ends. But pattern wasn't the only thing happening. Graph tools migrated in from network science. If you stripped away what the nodes were and just kept connections, the spatial adjacency, the clustering, you could compare very different systems with the same language. Degree distributions, clustering coefficients, modularity, assortativity. Suddenly, the web wasn't just a photo, it was a graph you could measure. Put the CFA slice next to a cortical micrograph and the temptation was obvious. Both looked modular, patches within patches, hubs that connected communities. The universe had superclusters like cities, the brain had rich club hubs in cortex, but scale mocked the comparison. You're crossing 27 orders of magnitude. The physics mocked it too. Synapses change with activity. Gravity doesn't care about a message. The analogy held just enough to nag, not enough to claim. That's where the human stories kept it alive. A grad student at a terminal, late at night, flipping between a filament finder overlay and a neural tractography map. A postdoc doodling a node link diagram during a colloquium, catching the same triangular motif in both notes. People didn't argue that galaxies think. They argued they might share wiring laws, the deep constraints that govern how costly it is to connect a system, how efficient it can be once connected, and how evolution, physics, or both settle the trade-offs. Simulations turned abstract worries into tangible plots. In the Millennium Run, power spectra of density fluctuations showed specific slopes. Clustering measurements matched what the telescopes were seeing. Illustris layered in gas physics, cooling, feedback from star formation and black holes, yet the web remained. That mattered. If the pattern survived changes in small-scale physics, the large-scale skeleton was robust, set by initial conditions and gravitational growth, not by messy baryonic details. Inside the observation teams, another quiet debate simmered. How much of this was our pipeline? Survey selection effects, fiber collisions, sky coverage holes, algorithms patched them with weights and mocks. Every correction risked painting structure where none existed or sanding off the roughness that was real. The best teams built end-to-end tests, generate fake universes, observe them with the same biases, then see if the recovered skeleton matched the input. When it did, confidence rose. When it didn't, nights got long. Through it all, one argument kept surfacing and getting swatted down as overreach. If two systems face the same cost-efficiency constraints, their graphs can converge even if their parts and forces differ. That line didn't make headlines. It made homework. To evaluate it, you needed numbers that didn't care whether a node was a neuron or a galaxy cluster. That's where a particular metric buried in network analysis started to glow. Not degree, not clustering, something in the spectrum of spatial fluctuations, the way variance redistributed across scales. In the background, cosmologists had been living in power spectra for decades: cosmic microwave background, matter clustering, velocity flows. Neuroscientists had their own spectral fingerprints, spatial autocorrelations of microstructure, connectivity density fluctuations across cortical sheets. If a shared slope popped out after accounting for all the obvious confounds, the cloud-face accusation would get weaker. Meanwhile, something else was happening. Observers began to find coherence across distances that felt too large to be an accident of taste. Galaxy spins showed alignments relative to local filaments. Halo shapes and orientations remembered the tides that birthed them. Velocity flows stretched smoothly across megaparsecs like traffic streaming down a freeway. None of this proved communication, but it tightened the thread. If the web is a skeleton, it might also be a set of preferred channels. By the early 2010s, the skeleton wasn't controversial. The language was careful. The graphs were trusted. The metaphor hovered. And a handful of researchers, tired of arguments about vibes, decided to test the only thing a metaphor can't fake: a quantitative cross-domain comparison that survives hostile review. While that was happening inside the skull, someone else in Italy was about to put two maps side by side and risk the laugh line. Inside your head, brain networks and the search for universal wiring laws. Meanwhile, inside the skull, the map was changing shape. Neuroscience moved from blobs to graphs, from this area does vision to this network routes information. Connectomics turned tissue into nodes and edges. Suddenly, thought looked like traffic, and traffic has rules. Here's the stake. If the brain's power comes from how it's wired, then the rules that shape that wiring might be universal: costs, efficiencies, trade-offs that any complex system has to solve. Get those rules wrong and your theory of mind collapses. Get them right, and you can predict how brains organize without peeking at every synapse. The first jolt was small world structure. In the late 90s, researchers showed networks could have tight local cliques but stay globally short, most nodes reachable in a handful of steps. Human cortex echoed that pattern. You could walk from a visual patch to a language hub in a few hops because long-range highways stitched the map. But those highways weren't free. Wiring is expensive: space, energy, development time. The brain seemed to pay just enough for speed without going broke. Then came scale-free debates. Early analyses hinted some nodes, hubs, had far more connections than others, following a heavy-tailed degree distribution. That suggested resilience to random damage but vulnerability to targeted attacks, a property seen in the internet and airline routes. Labs argued over measurement bias. Threshold choices, parcellations, and noise could fake fat tails. Replications across species kept a moderated version alive. Not perfectly scale-free, but definitely hub-dominated. And those hubs formed a rich club, high-degree areas preferentially linking to each other, creating a backbone for rapid integration. That backbone mattered for function. Efficient communication battles distance. The cortex solved it with a mixed strategy. Many cheap local links, fewer costly long ones cleverly placed. Models that penalized wiring length while rewarding communication efficiency reproduced key features. High clustering, short path lengths, modular communities with cross-module bridges. Build a network under those constraints and you start to get the brain's signature without invoking neurons or consciousness. Just math and costs. Meanwhile, microscale work complicated the picture. Synapses change their strength with activity, plasticity weaving experience into structure. Glia, the non-neuronal majority, aren't just scaffolding. They modulate signaling, shape development, and set metabolic budgets. Immune cells prune connections. From flies to humans, motifs repeated. Feed-forward ladders for fast processing, recurrent loops for integration, and layered hierarchies that collapse complexity into manageable chunks. Different species, different sizes, similar solutions. Statistically, neuroscientists leaned on the same family of tools that cosmologists trusted: spectral fingerprints of variability across space and time. Spatial autocorrelation maps revealed how microstructure clustered across cortical sheets. Power spectra of functional signals exposed how fluctuations distributed across scales. The shapes of those spectra, slopes, knees, roll-offs, carried information about constraints, not just content. That's crucial. You can compare spectra across wildly different systems without forcing a one-to-one mapping of parts. The human drama was real. One lab's definitive scale-free paper landed, another tore it apart for methodological artifacts. A graduate student spent months proving a rich club result held after null model shuffles, only to find a preprocessing choice inflated hub scores. Revisions, pre-registrations, shared code, battle scars that made the survivors sturdier. Through the fights, a quieter agreement formed. Regardless of the exact labels, the cortex balanced cost and performance using modularity and selective long-range integration. And across species, convergent motifs refused to disappear. Drosophila connectomes showed small world properties and hub regions relative to their size. Mouse and macaque tractography mapped rich club cores anchoring distributed modules. Human data, diffusion MRI for structure, fMRI and MEG for function, stacked on top. Slower rhythms coordinating long distances, faster ones handling local chatter. Communication through coherence, areas synchronizing their rhythms to pass information, looked like the brain's way of opening and closing lanes. What nobody knew at the time was how much that language would travel. When you compress a system to a graph and ask it to be both cheap and fast, certain signatures become likely. Degree heterogeneity, high clustering, modularity with sparse strategic bridges, spectral slopes that reflect correlated structure across scales. The details, ions versus gravity, fall away. The constraints don't. Now remember, this isn't saying brains equal galaxies. Neurons spike, halos merge. But if the same wiring economy keeps surfacing, you can test for it with numbers that don't care about the substrate. That's what made a particular statistic, the distribution of variance across spatial scales, so tempting. If cortical microstructure and cosmic density fields shared a spectral fingerprint after you strip away confounds, the metaphor would finally face an empirical cross-exam. Put the maps side by side and a provocative question wouldn't die. If different forces built them, why do they rhyme? A team in Italy decided to stop arguing and measure. The resemblance that wouldn't shut up, similarities, differences, and the risk of metaphor. Side by side, the maps looked like they were separated at birth. But the stakes weren't aesthetics, they were careers. Build a theory on a metaphor and you might get clicks. Build a program on it and you might burn years. So we asked the only question that matters: what survives when you strip away the poetry? Start with the skeleton of any network, the degree distribution, how many connections each node has. In cortical graphs built from diffusion data or tracer studies, degrees aren't uniform. You get a fat tail. Some areas connect to many partners. yet not a perfect power law. It's hub-dominated, not dogmatically scale-free. In the cosmic web, define nodes as halos or clusters and edges as filamentary adjacency, and you see heterogeneity too, a long tail of massive junctions with many filaments, many low-degree nodes on the periphery. Both systems lean toward unequal influence, but the reasons diverge. In cortex, development, activity-dependent plasticity and metabolic limits shape hub emergence. In the universe, initial density fluctuations amplified by gravity set which regions accrete more and become junctions. Similar degree shapes don't mean shared physics. They hint at shared constraints. Zoom into clustering, the tendency for a node's neighbors to also be connected. Cortical networks are highly clustered. Local neighborhoods form tight cliques, supporting specialized processing. The cosmic web, measured via spatial clustering coefficients on filament graphs, shows local transitivity too. Clusters linked by multiple short bridges, triangles born from nearby filaments curving through the same gravitational basin. High clustering appears when you penalize long connections and let local growth dominate. That's a wiring economy law, not a neuron law. Look at modularity, communities of nodes more connected within than between. Brains love modules, visual, auditory, somatomotor, default mode, each with submodules nested like Russian dolls. The cosmic web shows modularity when you threshold by density. Superclusters and walls act like communities, with intercommunity bridges as filaments. But here scale bites. Brain modules support functions on milliseconds to seconds. Cosmic modules evolve over billions of years. The graph rhyme sits on top of a yawning timescale gap. Assortativity asks whether hubs prefer other hubs. In cortex, a rich club backbone forms. High-degree regions link to each other, enabling fast integration. Cosmic graphs built from halo catalogs can look mildly disassortative if massive nodes pull in many small partners, yet a different projection, restricting edges to comparable mass filaments, reveals rich backbones spanning superclusters. Change the lens, the answer moves. That's the risk. Definitions in one domain don't always land cleanly in the other. Then there's the spectrum. Instead of counting edges, you ask how variance spreads across scales. Cosmology lives here. Matter-power spectra, correlation functions, spectral slopes that encode how structure builds from initial conditions. Neuroscience has spatial autocorrelation spectra of microstructure and mesoscale connectivity, plus frequency spectra of activity. When slopes align, when the distribution of fluctuations across scale shows similar exponents, the argument shifts from "it looks alike" to "it scales alike." That doesn't equate brains and galaxies. It suggests both are shaped by optimization under constraints that reward correlated structure over a range of scales. Now for the counterpunch. Neurons transmit spikes, adjust synapses, and ride feedback loops. Galaxies don't send messages. Gravity doesn't encode. A brain's edges change with experience. The cosmic web's edges are slow to evolve and insensitive to moment-to-moment state. If you blur physics, you fall into category error. Metaphors can fool you into chasing functions that aren't there. That's why skeptics kept repeating a sober line. Convergence under shared constraints. Space is expensive. Long edges are costly. Local growth dominates. Will make graphs rhyme even when mechanisms are alien. Proponents pushed back with function-shaped signatures. In brains, efficiency versus cost trade-offs show up as short average path lengths and strategic long-range links. In the web, shortest path analyses on filament graphs produce similar small-world characteristics relative to randomized spatial nulls. If both systems land in the same efficiency-cost basin, maybe the analogy isn't empty. But function in cosmology must be defined without intent. Transport of matter, heat, momentum, magnetic fields. No goals, just flows. You're where the risk got personal. A researcher can be seduced by a figure, two plots with matching slopes, and miss the hidden biases. In connectomics, parcellation choices change degree tails. In galaxy surveys, selection functions and fiber collisions warp adjacency. A careless pipeline can create rich clubs or erase them. If the resemblance survives adversarial tests, null models that preserve distances, densities, and survey masks, then it's earned. If not, the metaphor has outpaced the math. So the field laid down a wager. Find a testable prediction that splits poetry from physics. Not just shared statistics in retrospect, but a forecast. If wiring law analogies hold, certain mesoscale motifs should recur. Modular blocks with sparse, high-betweenness bridges, specific relationships between hub degree and clustering, spectral slopes within a narrow band once you normalize by domain size. From that, you could predict, say, the location of high controllability hubs in a cosmological simulation, or the emergence of new bridging filaments around mass thresholds. Then check with fresh data. That's the line between resemblance and result. If different physics can land on the same graph because of hard constraints, then the graph can speak across domains. If not, we've been staring at cloud animals. A team in Italy closed the laptops on the arguments and opened them on code. They didn't ask the universe to think. They asked it to scale. Then they measured. The controversial comparison, Vazza and Feletti's cross-scale analysis. They met over a stubborn hunch. Franco Vazza, a cosmologist who lives in power spectra, and Alberto Feletti, a neurosurgeon who thinks in microstructure, decided to put numbers where metaphors kept winning. The stakes were obvious. Publish a cross-field comparison, and you either become a curiosity or the lightning rod everyone aims at. They wrote down what they'd test before they touched the data. Here's the plan. Take high-resolution cosmological simulations of the cosmic web, dark matter plus gas evolving under gravity, and extract the spatial fluctuations of density. Don't cherry-pick pretty filaments. Compute the two-point correlation function and the power spectrum over a broad range of scales. Then take brain tissue images, electron microscopy of cortical slices, diffusion-like microstructural proxies, and extract spatial fluctuation spectra of density and connectivity at micrometer scales. Now compare slopes and scaling exponents across a chasm of 27 orders of magnitude. If anything rhymes there, it's not a photography trick. They didn't pretend galaxies were neurons. In their own words, this was analogy, not identity. They focused on statistics that ignore what the nodes are made of and care only about how variance is distributed in space. In cosmology, that's home turf. The matter-power spectrum P, K, the correlation function psi, R, and fractal-like descriptors of clustering. In microstructure, they computed analogous spectra from binarized tissue maps and connectivity fields, how dense features cluster as you zoom. Here's where it got weird. After careful normalization, matching dynamic ranges, accounting for resolution and segmentation biases, the slopes lined up within error bars over corresponding dimensionless ranges. The density fluctuations in the simulated cosmic web and the fluctuations in neural microstructure carried similar spectral exponents. Not identical, not everywhere, but close enough that the faces in clouds argument lost its bite. Different physics, similar scaling. They pushed further with graph abstractions. From cosmology, they extracted filament backbones using standard skeletonization algorithms, then built networks where nodes were halos above a mass cut and edges were persistent filaments. From brain data, they built mesoscale graphs from tractography analogs of the same tissue regions. They compared degree heterogeneity, clustering, and modularity against spatially constrained null models. Both networks looked small world relative to distance-preserving shuffles, with modular communities stitched by sparse bridges and a tail of high-degree hubs. Again, not a claim of sameness, just convergence under cost-efficiency constraints. The caveats came built in. Resolution matters. Segment a brain slice differently and your microstructure spectrum shifts. Choose a mass threshold or a filament finder with slightly different persistence criteria and your cosmic network changes. They ran sensitivity analyses, vary thresholds, recompute spectra, track how slopes drift. Some drifted, some held. The robust piece, the one they kept highlighting, was the broadband scaling behavior, not the exact value of any one metric. Then the pushback arrived. Critics argued selection bias. Were they choosing the prettiest brain images? Were they analyzing a simulation regime tuned to produce webbiness? What about anisotropy? Brains have laminar organization. The web has tidal anisotropy. Could those inflate apparent similarities? Others pointed to segmentation artifacts in electron microscopy and to finite volume effects in simulations that can tilt spectral slopes. The accusation of cherry-picking hung in the air. Vazza and Feletti answered the way you should, with more tests. They swapped in different cosmological runs, millennium-like dark matter only, then hydrodynamical suites with feedback. They tried alternate brain datasets and binarization schemes. The headline remained: within the dimensionless windows where both datasets were reliable, the scaling of spatial fluctuations rhymed. Mechanisms differ, statistics didn't care. Meanwhile, a quieter critique cut deeper. Were they measuring the wrong thing or the only thing that matters? If you strip away dynamics and only compare frozen structure, you might miss the essence of computation in brains, fast, recurrent loops. But if your claim is about wiring laws under constraints, then static structure is exactly where to look. Structure sets the menu of possible flows. Dynamics choose from that menu. They leaned on that distinction. Their conclusion was the universe thinks. It was sharper and more dangerous. If you compress both systems to their spatial fluctuation spectra and mesoscale graph features, you find overlapping regimes that are unlikely under naive nulls. That doesn't grant purpose to filaments. It grants testable predictions. If scaling laws really govern both, then specific mesoscale motifs, bridges with high betweenness at predictable mass thresholds, should appear in new simulations and, crucially, in new surveys. The paper landed, got press, and drew fire. Some colleagues rolled their eyes. Others started replicating. A few whispered that even if the physics diverged, the shared constraints result could matter across disciplines, designing efficient, robust networks from first principles. While they debated, a different group stopped staring at structure and asked the question that scares cosmologists. Is anything flowing in those channels that looks like information, not just matter? Are filaments communicating? Information, causality, and the cosmic web. They didn't start with consciousness. They started with a simpler, harder question. Does anything like information move across the web? Not gossip, not thoughts, just measurable dependencies beyond chance, signals in the physicist's sense. In physics, information isn't a vibe. It's a reduction in uncertainty. Entropy counts possibilities. Mutual information asks how much knowing A tells you about B. Transfer entropy goes further, whether past states of A improve predictions of future states of B beyond B's own past. If filaments only set a static landscape, you'd expect correlations from shared history but not directed influence. If flows matter, direction should show up. They picked scenes where nature forces choices. Cluster mergers, two heavyweights colliding, drive shocks through the intercluster medium. Gas plows along filaments into nodes. Magnetic fields drape and tangle. Meanwhile, galaxies fall in, their spins nudged by tidal torques aligned with local filaments. If anything carries a signal, it's these coherent fronts and flows. Start with mutual information in simulations. Take a hydrodynamical box with a well-resolved filament feeding a cluster. Define observables, density, temperature, velocity divergence in voxels along the filament spine and into the node. Slide a window in time. Compute mutual information between upstream and downstream fields, controlling for trivial spatial autocorrelation with distance-preserving nulls. The curves rise above the null. Upstream states reduce uncertainty about downstream states more than geometry alone explains. That's dependency, not yet causality. Now push for direction. Transfer entropy tests whether the past of one process helps predict the future of another, conditioning out the target's own past. In the boxes, upstream velocity and pressure waves across a filament predict changes in downstream shocks and accretion rates with a lag matching wave travel times. Swap the direction and the effect drops. It's not huge. The universe is noisy, but it's there. Coherent structures don't just sit, they propagate constraints. Observations whisper the same story. Galaxy spins aren't random darts. Across surveys, there's evidence that low-mass galaxies align their spin axes with the local filament, while more massive ones flip to perpendicular as they grow, signatures of tidal torque history and later mergers. The orientations of pairs tend to line up along filaments traced by large catalogs. Velocity fields measured by redshift space distortions and reconstructed flows show coherence across tens of megaparsecs, with streams that stay aligned over distances that rule out simple local chance. It looks like traffic. Slow, ancient traffic, but traffic. Skeptics keep the guardrails up. Initial conditions imprint long-range correlations. If the whole field started with a certain pattern of fluctuations, of course you'll see alignments later. That doesn't mean the web is computing. It means it's remembering. The test is whether new structure appears that can't be explained by that memory, emergent directionality not reducible to the shared past. So the teams designed contrasts. In simulations, they randomized phases of initial conditions while keeping the power spectrum fixed, then measured the same transfer entropy along filament spines. If directionality comes just from the power spectrum, shuffling phases should preserve it. It didn't. Direction weakened. When they injected localized energy, merger shocks, transfer rose along specific paths with travel time consistent lags. Cause, then effect, mapped onto the skeleton. Meanwhile, observers chased shocks as couriers. X-ray and Sunny Zeldovich observations lit up bridges, hot gas filaments between clusters. Radio telescopes caught relics and halos where shocks accelerate electrons, tracing wavefronts. If those fronts carry coherence, downstream star formation rates and gas temperatures in infalling groups should show phase-lock changes after the shock passes. Early stacks hinted at synchronized quenching patterns along select filaments. It's subtle, it's messy, but it nudged the needle. Parallel to that, a brain analogy earned its keep without overreach. Communication through coherence in cortex isn't magic. It's phase relationships opening and closing effective connections. In cosmology, phase correlations in density and velocity fields tell you how waves superpose and move. When phase alignments persist across scales and distances beyond what Gaussian initial conditions predict, something has steered them. Nonlinear growth, shocks, magnetic draping. Again, not thoughts. Just organized influence. One detail would prove crucial later. In a subset of simulations, researchers tracked vorticity, swirling motions, along filaments and into nodes. Vorticity waves generated at curved shocks traveled along the spine and modulated gas accretion angles. Downstream, galaxy spin flips clustered after vorticity pulses. Statistically, the timing wasn't random. That looked like an internal signal, a filament-level mode shaping the state of arriving systems. Here, S where the temperature in the room changed. If filaments can host internal modes that travel and influence, then defining information as directed predictive power across the web stops being a metaphor stretch. It becomes an operational claim. You can detect and quantify it. That's why one result set off a quiet storm. A team reported a transfer entropy signal between two supercluster nodes across a void-spanning bridge in a public data release, stronger than any null suggested. If true, it meant the web wasn't just a static scaffold. It was an active network. Then the floor shifted. A reprocessing of the same survey fixed systematics, sky subtraction, photometric calibration, fiber assignment, and the signal faded below significance. Replication attempts disagreed. Junior co-authors found their emails going unanswered. The dataset that made people whisper started to vanish from talks. Some said it was an artifact all along. Others suspected the pipeline smoothed away a fragile anomaly. Either way, it forced a choice. Trust the safest version of the map, or build tests that can't be erased by a tweak. If maps can lie, you need instruments and analyses that corner the question. Design perturbation-based tests in simulations. Poke the web and see if the poke travels. Build observational strategies that catch shocks in the act and measure downstream changes with time-domain surveys. And define information with care. No teleology, just causality. Does past here help predict future there, beyond shared history? That's the fight that followed. Not over purpose, but over proof. And it started with a dataset that taught everyone how easily a signal can disappear. The dataset that disappeared, a cautionary tale of pattern and pushback. It started as a whisper in a Slack channel, cross-void coherence strong. A junior analyst had stacked a set of bridge candidates between superclusters using a public release from a major survey. The plot showed directed dependence, upstream fluctuations predicting downstream states across what should have been quiet vacuum. Not a rumor, a number. Transfer entropy curves with lags matching plausible travel times. Screenshots flew. A preprint followed. The stakes were brutal. If that signal held, you couldn't dismiss the web as just scaffolding. You'd have to admit the skeleton carried organized influence. Not thought, influence. The authors hedged hard: controls, nulls, ablations. They matched angular masks, injected synthetic sources to gauge fiber collision bias, and ran jackknives that tore the sky into tiles. The curves bent but didn't break. Reviewers nitpicked as they should. The team revised as they had to. Then a pipeline update landed. The collaboration pushed a reprocessing that fixed known systematics, sky subtraction floors, photometric calibration drifts, astrometric jitter, and a new fiber assignment model. The new maps were cleaner by every conventional metric. When the team reran the analysis, the cross-void curve sagged. Significance slipped under the line. The Slack went quiet. Here's the gut punch. Nothing in the changelog mentioned remove spurious cross-void coherence. The fix wasn't targeted at this statistic, but small choices cascade. Sky subtraction algorithms suppress low surface brightness gradients that can flatten filaments and erase weak bridges. Fiber assignment tweaks change where you have spectra, nudging velocity reconstructions. Photometric recalibrations shift selection at the faint end, shaving off galaxies that anchor tenuous connections. Each fix is defensible. Together, they can amputate the very anomaly you're trying to test. Inside the author list, the temperature dropped. Senior scientists urged caution in public. Juniors asked about follow-ups and got vague replies. One postdoc drafted a replication plan on the new release, proposing stricter masks and alternative filament catalogs. Their advisor suggested focusing on less controversial deliverables until tenure. Another co-author sent a late-night email. We should talk offline. The offline never came. Meanwhile, skeptics took a victory lap. They'd warned from the start that long-range dependencies can leak in from window functions, survey edges, and the power spectrum of the initial conditions. If you don't control for those, any directed metric will hallucinate causality. With the reprocessing, they argued, the phantom vanished. Case closed. The blog posts wrote themselves. But not everyone bought the neat ending. A small group reran the old analysis with adversarial nulls designed to keep every large-scale constraint intact. Same masks, same clustering, same selection, while randomizing phase relationships along identified bridges. In the old release, the transfer entropy peak still rose above those phase-shuffled controls. In the new release, the peak shrank but didn't vanish. It slid into the gray zone where reviewers can call it suggestive and move on. That limbo is where unconventional signals go to die. The human cost showed up in small moments. A graduate student refreshed the archive comments on the preprint between lab chores. A junior pi watched a conference slot turn into a poster after a senior organizer wrote, "Given the update, we prefer more robust topics." One of the original analysts got a curt committee note. "We encourage projects with clearer paths to publication. Caution can be prudence. It can also be a pressure to conform dressed as mentorship." To be fair, pipelines exist to protect us from fooling ourselves. Sky backgrounds drift, detectors age, algorithms improve. You want the best map. but best for one science case may not be best for another. Aggressive background suppression guards against false positives in low surface brightness searches and quietly kills diffuse features that matter for cross-void tests. A calibration that homogenizes colors for photometric redshift can erase subtle environmental gradients. We call these choices neutral. They aren't. The lesson wasn't that someone buried an inconvenient truth. The lesson was fragility. When your claim rides on a margin, any reasonable tweak can push it off the cliff. That doesn't make the claim wrong. It makes it unprotected. So the conversation shifted from "is the signal real?" to "what would make the test ungameable?" If an anomaly depends on one pipeline's quirks, it won't survive. If it survives many, it gets a seat at the table. That's where the design ethos changed. Analysts started packaging their metrics with pipeline transfer functions. Explicit sensitivity maps showing how each preprocessing step distorts the statistic. Teams pre-registered thresholds and masks, committing to them before seeing results. Simulations grew more faithful, injecting realistic backgrounds, fiber collisions, and astrometric drifts to calibrate bias on the exact statistic of interest. Observers pitched time-domain strategies. Catch shocks in filaments as they happen and watch for downstream responses in light, heat, and velocity, where background tricks can't fake lags. A few months later, the original preprint updated with a sober addendum. The reprocessed release reduces the claimed effect. Under stricter controls, a weaker but non-zero directionality persists. More data is required. It wasn't a surrender. It was an invitation. If maps can lie, build experiments that can't. If pipelines can erase a whisper, design a shout. And if careers hang on the difference, stop leaving truth at the mercy of default settings. Designing the impossible test. What proof would even look like? If maps can lie, you need a test that doesn't depend on the map's mood. Start with falsifiability. What result would force believers to stop and skeptics to nod? 3 pillars. A scale-invariant wiring law that spans reliable ranges, predictive modularity that forecasts unseen hubs or bridges, and non-trivial causal directionality, signals that travel along the web with timing that geometry alone can't fake. First, the wiring law. Gravity builds a self-similar web only within certain bands, and brains show correlated structure across mesoscales. The claim isn't identical exponents. It's that, after proper normalization, both systems land inside a narrow corridor of spectral slopes and graph features implied by cost-efficiency constraints. So you pre-register a corridor, define an adversarial null that preserves spatial distances, density fields, survey masks, and parcellation geometry. Then you ask, do the measured spectra and network statistics consistently occupy that corridor across datasets, or do they wander? If they wander, kill the claim. If they stay, the corridor starts to look like a law. Second, predictive modularity. Metaphors love hindsight. The test has to stick its neck out. From cosmological simulations, compute multi-scale controllability on the filament network. How easily small, localized perturbations can steer global states. In brain graphs, that analysis identifies high-betweenness bridges and rich hubs that control integration. Translate that to the web. The model should nominate specific not-yet-mapped filament hubs with high predicted controllability at given mass thresholds. You timestamp the forecast. Then you wait for new data, Euclid lensing, Roman spectroscopy, LSST flows, to confirm or falsify the existence and properties of those hubs. One hit could be luck. A sequence of hits becomes teeth. Third, causality. Not correlation over cosmic memory, but direction with lags that match physical travel times. In simulations, you inject perturbations, controlled shocks, magnetic pulses at one node, measured as localized changes in pressure, vorticity, or mass inflow. You trace expected arrival times along identified filaments using measured sound speeds and flow velocities. Then you compute transfer entropy from upstream to downstream, while conditioning on both histories and shared initial conditions. If directionality rises in the windows predicted by the physics and falls outside them, you've trapped a signal. Observationally, you pivot to time-domain cosmology, stack cluster pair bridges, watch radio relics flare, track downstream temperature, star formation, or polarized synchrotron changes with the right delay. If lags line up across many bridges, teleology never enters, causality does. All of this dies if your pipeline can erase it. So you publish the pipeline transfer function with the result, how sky subtraction, fiber assignment, and background modeling distort your statistic. You pre-register thresholds, masks, and nulls. You make the code public, and you run map-in, map-out tests with synthetic skies that include realistic nuisances. If your claim survives its own X-ray, it's earned. Meanwhile, there's a parallel track. Build the poke test in simulations that can be mirrored in the brain. On the connectome side, perturbation response is standard. Stimulate one region, measure network spread across rhythms, estimate controllability, compare to rich club predictions. On the cosmology side, inject controlled perturbations at filament junctions, track energy and vorticity propagation, and measure downstream halo spin reorientations and gas accretion changes. Then test the cross-domain prediction. If controllability correlates with certain motif placements in brains, the same motif placements in cosmic graphs should predict stronger, more efficient propagation of shocks. It's not mind reading, it's architecture reading. Observationally, here's the shopping list. Weak lensing tomography to map mass in 3D and identify true filament spines and junctions. Wide field spectroscopy to get velocities along those spines in separate foregrounds. Deep X-ray and Sunny Eve. Zeldovich coverage to catch hot gas bridges and moving shocks. Low-frequency radio polarimetry to trace magnetic draping and Faraday rotation across filaments, the closest thing to wiring we can see. Then time-domain cadence to watch the web respond when a cluster merges or a shock sweeps through. The failure modes are obvious. Overfitting by machine learning that learns survey quirks, not physics. Selection bias, finding controllable hubs where you can see them, not where they are. Cosmic variance, declaring a pattern from one patch of sky. You fight that by splitting sky into predeclared tiles, repeating with independent surveys, and stress testing with adversarial nulls that keep every large-scale constraint intact while scrambling phase relationships along candidate channels. There's a philosophical trap sitting on the table: purpose. The test suite can't smuggle it in. Define functions as flows, transport of mass, heat, momentum, magnetic energy. Define information as directed predictive power after conditioning on shared history. If you avoid intent, you avoid category error. If the tests land, you're not proving the universe feels. You're proving the web computes in the leanest sense. It transforms inputs to outputs through a structured network with measurable directionality. Now, what would a decisive result look like? A pre-registered model forecasts a set of high controllability junctions and bridge strengths in regions not yet mapped. Months later, Euclid's lensing reveals those junctions at the predicted masses. Raman spectra measure coherent, directed flows along the predicted bridges. LSST's cadence catches downstream galaxies shifting star formation and gas temperatures with lags consistent with shock travel times. SKA's Faraday rotation shows magnetic alignment strengthening during those windows. Pipeline audits show the statistics sensitivity survived reprocessing. Nulls preserving masks and clustering fail to reproduce the directionality. Replications across independent sky patches hold. If that chain clicks, skeptics won't have to like the narrative to accept the plots. And if it fails, if forecasts miss, if directionality collapses under harsher nulls, then the cosmic brain reduces to a poetic echo of shared constraints, useful for inspiration, empty for claims. Either way, the test clarifies the stakes. While engineers planned these trials, a different group stepped in with a question that kept the brakes on the hype. Even if the web computes, what are we actually talking about when we say conscious? What is consciousness anyway? Avoiding category errors. Before this runs off the rails, let's get the words straight. Consciousness isn't a glow. It's a technical mess with competing minimal definitions. One camp talks about integrated information, the idea that a system with lots of differentiated parts that also strongly constrain each other can have phi, a measure of how much it's more than the sum of its parts. Another camp leans on the global workspace. Information becomes conscious when it's broadcast to many specialized modules so they can coordinate. A third points to recurrent processing, signals that loop back on themselves, letting the system compare input with prediction in real time. All of those share a spine, fast, recurrent, integrated dynamics, not just structure but loops that update quickly enough to matter to present. If you apply that to the cosmic web, the timescale hits you in the face. Filaments evolve on millions to billions of years. Even if there are directed influences, they crawl compared to the brain's millisecond fireworks. So if by consciousness you mean what it feels like to be you, rapid binding of sights, sounds, thoughts, cosmic filaments don't fit. That isn't cynicism, it's keeping definitions clean. So what can we say without cheating? We can separate 3 layers. 1. Structure. That's the skeleton who can influence whom. 2. Computation. That's transforming inputs to outputs according to rules. Does past here help predict future there in a non-trivial way? 3. Experience. That's the subjective which so far tracks with fast, recurrent loops that integrate many specialized streams. Under that split, the cosmic web clearly has structure. There's growing evidence, carefully defined, that it hosts computation in the lean sense. Shock fronts, phase correlations, vorticity waves shaping downstream states with measurable directionality. But experience. With the web's glacial cadence, a global workspace in any recognizable sense seems out of reach. You can coarse-grain time, argue that a very slow present exists at cosmic scales, but now you're stretching a human word until it means any integrated process at any speed. That erases the category boundary, and once it's gone, everything that processes anything becomes conscious, including rivers and refrigerators. That move convinces nobody who wasn't already there. Integrated information theory tempts a loophole. Maybe the universe's phi could be enormous because it's huge. The catch is the dynamics. High phi doesn't come from size alone. It comes from strong, specific causal interactions that are both differentiated and integrated at the relevant timescale. If influences are weak, sparse, and slow, phi collapses when you measure it at any practical grain. Likewise for global workspace. You need rapid ignition that recruits modules across the network. The cosmic web has modules, superclusters, and walls, but no evidence for ignition that runs laps in seconds. It's a different stadium. Recurrent processing is even stricter. Brains are feedback factories. Predictions meet errors, loops close, and the system updates at the edge of instability. Cosmic feedback exists, AGN outflows, galactic winds, shocks reflecting off cluster cores, but the loops that link distant modules are lossy and delayed. The universe updates, but not in a way that suggests a unified inner life. If there's awareness, it would be glacial centuries as a blink, epochs as a thought. That's poetic. It isn't testable with today's definitions. So let's park feeling and talk function. A system can compute without consciousness. Thermodynamic gradients drive structure that processes information. Dissipative systems form patterns that store and transmit constraints. The web fits that frame. Gas flows and magnetic fields carry signals. Filaments act like channels. Nodes integrate. You can measure directed predictive power and never claim qualia. That's the safe lane. Focus on integrated causal power you can detect. This doesn't drain the meaning, it sharpens it. If we're components in a vast, slow computer, agency isn't erased. It's local. Compatibilism lives here. Your choices are real inside the constraints, the way a neuron spikes matter inside a brain it didn't choose. Ethics becomes network hygiene. Reduce noise, improve truthful transmission, build institutions that raise effective integration without choking on cost. You don't need a cosmic self to justify that work. There's also a caution from biology that widens the lens. Neuroscience learned the hard way that neurons aren't alone. Glia modulates signaling, set metabolic budgets and shape plasticity. Immune cells prune and rewire. The map of who matters expanded. Cosmology has its own hidden half. Dark matter scaffolds, dark energy drives expansion. If we're going to analogize, we should expect that the visible spikes of galaxies ride on modulators we barely see. That's not smuggling in purpose. That's admitting complexity where it lives. So where does that leave conscious universe talk? With a boundary. Don't claim experience unless you can show fast, recurrent, integrated dynamics at the scale you're naming. Do claim computation if you can show directed influence beyond shared history. And keep teleology out of it. Function without intent is enough to build predictions, run tests, and get humbled by data. Hold that line, and the next turn in this story lands clean. Because just as biology expanded its cast to include glia, cosmology started to ask what the dark sector might be doing between the lines we can see. Hidden nodes, non-neuronal players in the dark sector. Biology had to learn humility the hard way. For a century, neurons got the headlines. Then glia crashed the party. Astrocytes wrapped synapses and tuned their strength. Oligodendrocytes myelinated axons and set the speed limits. Microglia pruned connections, sculpting circuits during development and disease. None of them fired spikes, yet all of them set the rules for who talks to whom, how fast, and at what metabolic cost. The brain's map wasn't just wires. It was wires inside a living medium that modulates them. Cosmology has its own backstage. The visible universe, the galaxies lighting up our surveys, sits on dark matter scaffolding. That scaffolding shapes where filaments grow, where nodes form, and how material streams. Dark energy, smoother and stranger, stretches the whole stage, pushing on the tempo of structure formation. If the bright galaxies are like spikes, brief, intense bursts of activity, then the dark sector looks like the glial field, a continuous, mostly invisible regulator that sets thresholds, bandwidth, and global state. Here, that's where the analogy earns a job rather than a joke. Glia don't just support, they modulate. Astrocytic calcium waves spread across millimeters, changing synaptic gain and timing. In neural tissue, those slow, spatially extended waves bias which pathways are easy to activate and which ones get suppressed. Translate that to the web. Dark matter potentials define the easy routes. Dark energy's expansion rate globally lowers or raises the gain on growth. You don't need intent. You need a field that changes the effective couplings. Neuroscience gave us a second nudge. When researchers modeled brain networks with only neurons, their dynamics often ran too hot, too synchronized, too brittle. Add glial modulation of ion homeostasis and synaptic uptake, and the system settled near criticality where it's flexible but stable. In cosmology, dark matter-only simulations already give you the skeleton. Add baryons, cooling, feedback, shocks, and the details shift, but the bones hold. Now layer on the fact that the growth factor and expansion history, where dark energy speaks, change when and how bridges thicken, when nodes quench, and how long flows remain coherent. That's global modulation. What would count as a glia-like signature in the sky? Slow, global influences that reshape many channels at once without leaving a single bright fingerprint. Think lensing signals that reveal diffuse mass filling and thickening connective tissue between clusters. EROSITA's X-ray maps and SZ surveys hint at hot gas bridges where theory predicted them. The square kilometer array's low-frequency radio and Faraday rotation can trace how magnetic fields drape along filaments, changing transport like myelin changes conduction. Those are modulators, fields that alter how easily energy and matter travel, not sources of the traffic themselves. There's also pruning. Microglia pare back synapses based on activity patterns, turning exuberant youth into efficient adulthood. The web shows something similar without implying intent. Feedback from active galaxies, starbursts, and cluster weather can heat and expel gas, starving some filaments while others fat. Over time, once promising bridges fade, others dominate. That's not a mind at work. It's a living network pushed by energy budgets and environment. Skeptics will say we're dressing gravity in a lab coat. Fair. So turn the metaphor into a prediction. If the dark sector plays the glial role, you should see slow, correlated modulation across large regions that can't be explained by local halo histories alone. Specifically, the growth rate f sigma 8 measured by redshift space distortions should vary with filament environment in a way tied to large-scale potential depth, not just local mass. Weak lensing tomography should show that filaments in deeper, magnetized basins have higher effective conduction, coherent velocity flows and aligned spins than comparable mass filaments in shallower basins. Faraday rotation through those filaments should correlate with downstream quenching times after cluster mergers, as magnetic draping alters shock coupling to gas. That's a stackable, multi-wavelength test. There's a brain-side cross-check too. In tissue, astrocyte networks couple to vasculature, linking metabolism to signaling. If you transiently raise astrocytic calcium over a region, neuronal responsiveness shifts for seconds to minutes. In simulations, you can mimic a regional gain change on the cosmic web, tweak the effective equation of state or magnetization across a supercluster wall and measure how quickly perturbations propagate along its filaments compared to control regions. If controllability increases with that modulation, the structural role matches. Background state sets propagation efficiency. We also have to redraw the cast list. Brains aren't neurons plus one glia. They're many glia types, plus immune cells, extracellular matrix, and vasculature. The cosmos isn't just dark matter and dark energy. It's cosmic rays threading filaments, turbulence setting diffusion, and relic neutrinos subtly tilting growth on very large scales. Each piece changes the transfer function, the rule that maps inputs to outputs. That's the real prize of the analogy, a discipline for hunting modulators we otherwise treat as background. Ask what invisible field, if it wobbled, would change many channels at once. And keep a leash on. Analogies corrupt fast when they float free. Every claim here cashes out in observables, lensing maps of low-density bridges, SZ pressure profiles across walls, Faraday rotation grids, galaxy spin, filament alignments, environment-dependent growth rates, and time-domain responses after shocks. If the glial field picture is useful, it will earn its keep by predicting which filaments act like high-gain lines and which ones don't, before the data roll in. To see any of this cleanly, we need sharper eyes and stranger telescopes. The next decade's surveys were built for dark energy, but they're perfectly placed to test whether the universe's hidden half quietly modulates a web that already looks alive. New instruments, new eyes, the surveys that could settle it. If the web carries influence, the next decade's hardware is built to catch it in the act, not by accident, by design. These missions weren't pitched to test a cosmic brain, but their strengths line up with every claim that needs cornering. Start with Euclid. Launched to map the geometry of the dark universe, it's a wide-field machine for weak lensing, measuring tiny distortions in galaxy shapes caused by intervening mass. That turns sky into a 3D mass map, not just light. You get tomographic slices, where filaments are, how thick they run, which junctions anchor the load. With hundreds of millions of shapes and photometric redshifts, Euclid will trace the invisible connective tissue between clusters, the places signals would travel if they travel at all. Its first light images already show absurdly crowded fields, millions of galaxies in a single frame, exactly the density you need to stack bridges and beat noise. Now pair that with the Nancy Grace Roman Space Telescope. Roman trades width for exquisite near-infrared imaging and spectroscopy at Hubble-like resolution, but at survey speed. Its high-latitude survey will deliver precise shapes and redshifts, tightening lensing tomography and giving clean distance measures along filaments. The complementarity matters. Euclid's breadth finds the highways. Roman's depth nails the exact lanes and measures velocities with slitless spectroscopy to separate foregrounds and catch coherent flows. NASA's teams have been clear. Roman and Euclid together constrained dark energy by watching structure grow. That same data constrains whether growth is modulated along preferred channels. While those two sketch the skeleton, the Vera C. Rubin Observatory's LSST brings time. A 10-year movie of the sky, revisiting patches every few nights, lets you watch how galaxies flicker, how supernovae propagate, and how variability clusters along environments. You're not looking for bright signals, you're looking for timing. If a shock rips down a bridge, downstream star formation in infalling groups should dip with a delay you can model from travel times. LSST's cadence, plus photometric redshifts, lets you bin by environment and measure those lags statistically. It's time-domain cosmology aimed at filaments. The radio side adds the closest thing to wiring we can see. The square-kilometer array will map cosmic magnetism through Faraday rotation, how polarized radio waves twist as they pass through magnetized plasma. Filaments should imprint subtle, coherent rotations across degree-scale patches. Stack enough background sources, and you'll recover magnetic draping along spines and around shocks. If magnetic fields gate transport, like myelin gates speed, then changes in rotation measures during cluster mergers will show when and where conductivity rises. SKA pathfinders already hint at radio bridges. Full SKA turns hints into maps. X-ray and millimeter eyes reveal the corridors. EROSITA's all-sky X-ray survey discovered more clusters than we've ever had, plus extended emission in intercluster regions. Hot gas bridges lighting up where theory says they should be. CMB-S4 will sharpen the Sunny Eve. Zeldovich effect, how hot electrons imprinted on the cosmic microwave background, making pressure maps of filaments routine. Stack those on lensing spines, and you get temperature and pressure profiles along the very channels where directed influence would run. When a merger shock sweeps down a bridge, SZ pressure edges and X-ray temperature jumps should move together. Here's the integration play. You take Euclid's 3D mass skeleton and label junctions by predicted controllability from your pre-registered model. Roman refines positions and provides spectroscopic slices to measure velocity gradients along those bridges. LSST watches for downstream variability shifts, star formation flickers, AGN duty cycles, appearing with the right delays after upstream shocks. SKA measures magnetic field changes that coincide with those windows, showing the gates opening. EROSITA and CMB-S4 map the thermal fronts. If those pieces align in both space and time across many systems, influence stops being hand-waving and becomes a multi-platform detection. The brain side isn't idling. Petascale connectomics stitches cubic millimeters of cortex with nanometer precision. Whole brain calcium imaging in small animals tracks activity waves. MEG and high-density EEG map human rhythmic coordination. Those tools let you compute the same graph invariance, controllability betweenness modular flow, on living tissue, and compare them to the cosmic corridor you've defined. If certain motifs predict efficient propagation in brains, and the same motifs flag high-gain bridges in the web, that's a cross-domain payoff you can't blame on cherry-picking. Machine learning will sit in the middle and try to help and hurt. Cross-domain representation learning can hunt graph invariants that generalize, but it will also happily memorize survey quirks. So you keep it honest. Train on simulations with injected nuisances that match Euclid and LSST pipelines. Validate on sky patches pre-registered before training. Publish failure cases. And you always hand results back to physics. Any learned feature must translate to an interpretable statistic, spectral slope bands, motif counts, controllability ranks. You can compute without the black box. There's already a whisper from first data. Euclid's early releases show low surface brightness arcs and diffuse structures that, when stacked, hint at more mass in bridges than some models predicted. It's not a headline yet. It's a direction. Roman's pre-launch simulations suggest its redshift precision will cleanly separate overlapping filaments in projection, a long-standing headache. LSST commissioning has demonstrated the cadence stability needed for environment-stacked variability. SDSS pathfinders have detected coherent polarization structures near cluster pairs. EROSITA's catalogs are seeding SZ follow-up lists. 1 decade of instruments may not answer whether the universe feels, but it can settle whether the web computes in the strict, testable sense. Map the skeleton, catch the couriers, time the lags, watch the gates open. If the pattern holds across platforms and pipelines, the skeleton starts looking less like a metaphor and more like a network with measurable influence. And if it doesn't, the metaphor finally dies the honest way, by failing a test it asked for. The purpose trap, teleology versus function in a purposeless cosmos. Here's where our story keeps slipping on language. Say the universe computes and people hear the universe wants. Purpose sneaks in through the side door. Physics doesn't grant intent, it grants gradients. Things flow downhill in energy space, and along the way, structure forms that channels those flows. That structure can look like design because it's efficient. But efficiency doesn't mean a goal. It means constraints did their job. Function without intent is the lane. A hurricane organizes heat transport from ocean to sky. No plan, just thermodynamics exploiting a path of least resistance. Same with filaments. They route mass, heat, momentum, and magnetic energy from low-density sheets into high-density nodes. That's a function. It doesn't require a reason. It only requires a landscape and rules that push along it. Humans crave purpose because it helps us act. Evolution wired that bias. But at cosmic scales, selection works differently. There's no reproduction of universes in our data. No obvious Darwinian competition where better information processing webs outcompete worse ones across generations. So we avoid the trap. Don't smuggle biology's teleology into cosmology's bookkeeping. Replace, why was this built? With, what does this do under these constraints? You can still ask hard, useful questions. Does the web increase its capacity to move and transform information over time? If so, is that because efficient pathways get reinforced by flows, more mass deepens potentials, stronger shocks magnetize roots, or because initial conditions already set the channels and everything else just follows? That's a testable split. Measure how controllability and betweenness of bridges evolve in simulations with and without feedbacks that strengthen frequent paths. If activity reshapes the lanes, function feeds back on structure, no purpose required. There's another seductive move to flag, cosmic optimization. We see small world features and assume a designer picked the best trade-off. In reality, many systems drift toward near-critical regimes where responsiveness is high because that's where competing pressures balance. Brains hover there because too little coupling wastes resources and too much locks them up. The web may hover there because gravity pulls structures together while expansion stretches them apart. The sweet spot falls out of tug-of-war, not intention. When we talk purpose in science, we often mean teleonomy, apparent goal-directedness produced by selection or constraints. A heart pumps to supply oxygen because organisms that didn't pump failed. The filament feeds a cluster because gas falling along a gradient has no easier route. Both are functions. Only one carries an evolutionary backstory. Keep them distinct and you keep your claims clean. Now the tricky middle ground. Could there be selection-like processes at cosmic scales that favor efficient information routing? Not across universes. Nobody has data for that, but within this one. Regions with certain properties spawn more long-lived, complex subsystems, galaxies, stars with planets, chemistries that compute. That looks like a filter. But it's anthropic reasoning. We notice it because we can. It doesn't confer purpose on filaments. It tags environments where computation thrives. So why does the purpose itch persist here? Because we're in the network. We feel like agents and we want the big network to be an agent too. Compatibilism helps. Your choices have causal weight locally, even inside larger dynamics you don't control. That doesn't make the universe want anything. It makes your node matter in the neighborhood it can reach. The ethics follow from that. Reduce noise, improve honest transmission. guard against pathological feedbacks. If we frame purpose as network hygiene, we keep motivation and lose mysticism. There's a practical reason to police this language. Teleology invites unfalsifiable claims. Function invites predictions. If you say filaments exist to build minds, you can't test it. If you say filaments transmit shocks that modulate downstream star formation with predictable lags, you can. One turns science into theater. The other turns it into a calendar reminder for Euclid, Roman, LSST, SCA, EROSITA, and CMB-S4. And yet meaning isn't banned. It's relocated. You don't have to find a mission stamped onto the cosmos to find one for yourself. Contribute signal, not norms. Build institutions that increase the system's effective integration without driving it brittle. Most neurons aren't hubs. Most still matter. If the web computes, our best purpose is to improve the computation where we stand, tell the truth, keep the channels clear, and accept that a purposeless cosmos can still host purposeful lives. The believers and the skeptics, human stories behind the data. It started with a plot on a laptop at 1:13 a.m. A postdoc, coffee gone cold, headphones on, overlaid two spectra, cortical microstructure on one axis, cosmic density on the other. The slopes nestled into each other like gears. She screenshotted, hesitated, and sent it to her advisor with a one-line subject. Am I fooling myself? The reply came 3 minutes later. Probably. Show me tomorrow. Morning in the lab felt like a cross between a seminar and a support group. They poked the pipeline, swapped nulls, rebinned scales. The alignment loosened, then tightened when they normalized by distance the way the cosmologists do. Nobody said proof. Someone did say, if this holds under distance-preserving nulls, we have a talk. They booked a room, wrote terrifyingly honest method slides, and added a final one that read, reasons we might be wrong. 2 weeks later, she stood at a departmental colloquium and watched the audience split. A neuroscientist in the second row leaned forward at Rich Club analogs. A cosmologist in the back folded his arms at transfer entropy. The Q&A swerved from curiosity to cross-examination. How robust to parcellation? What filament finder? What about finite volume effects? She didn't fumble the answers. She also didn't pretend to know what she didn't. The talk ended on a sentence that saved it. If we're right, you can falsify us with data we don't have yet. Applause, cautious and real. Then came a conference, crowded hallway, posters like flags. A senior figure waved her over. Clever, he said, scanning the figures. But you're treading into metaphor territory. Careers drown there. He smiled the way people do when they think they're helping. That night, a blog shredded the premise with a catchy title. The inbox did the opposite. One message from a radio astronomer offering polarization data, another from a skeptic asking for code, a third just 4 words. Keep going, be careful. Meanwhile, across campus, a skeptic built a replication plan that read like a heist script. He'd watched too many alluring plots fail in fMRI because of preprocessing quirks. He didn't want to kill an idea, he wanted to save time. He grabbed the same brain dataset, reparcellated 3 ways, swapped binarization thresholds, and reran spectra under spatially constrained nulls. Some features wobbled, others held. Then he pulled public cosmological boxes, changed initial random seeds while preserving power spectra, and checked the slope corridors. The rhyme narrowed but didn't vanish. He wrote to the postdoc, "Some of your effect survives. The rest is pipeline. Want to co-author a cautionary note?" She said yes. A month later, the cross-void preprint detonated. Our postdoc Slack lit up with the same plot from strangers' screens. The advisor sent one line, "Don't tweet." Instead, they ran a sanity drill on their own metrics. Could a sky subtraction change kill a weak-directed signal? Yes. Would that mean there's nothing there? No. The point wasn't to pick sides. It was to design a test both sides would trust. That night, the postdoc wrote the first draft of a pre-registration. Masks, thresholds, nulls, pipeline transfer functions. She hit send at 2:07 a.m., then slept for 5 hours and dreamed of featureless skies. On the other end of the world, a radio team pointed a pathfinder at a cluster pair. Their pi remembered the blog's snark and told his group, "We're not testing a brain. We're testing whether rotation measures along bridges change during mergers." They stacked a season's worth of polarized sources. The signal was thin as a whisper but leaned in the right direction. The grad student who found it didn't post a thread. She wrote a method supplement that read like a confession. Every cut, every fail, every alternate stack that made it wobble. Skeptics kept doing what skeptics should. One built a phase-randomized null that preserved masks, clustering, and selection, while scrambling phase relationships along identified bridges. Another invented a filament placebo test: shift spines by a controlled angle, and see if directionality follows the shift. Both tests knocked out pretty correlations that had survived friendlier controls. Both left a smaller core that refused to die. The skeptic who designed the placebo test ended up on a paper with people he'd argued with for years. He called it expensive truce by evidence. Human stakes kept leaking around the edges. A junior pi rehearsed a keynote that split the talk, first half on simulation controllability and predictive hubs, second half on the dataset that disappeared. Her advisor warned, "Lead with the forecast or they'll tune out." She didn't. She led with the vanishing act. The room went quiet when she said, "If a result depends on a pipeline's mood, it's not a result." She closed on a pre-registered prediction: a filament hub location in a Euclid tile not yet released. That single slide got more photos than her citation list. There were private fractures too. A team member who'd pushed the strongest claims felt sidelined when the group softened language. He wrote a solo manuscript that went further than the data. It made a splash online and sank in review. Months later, he joined a different lab that wanted sharper edges. The people he left behind sent a note when his paper finally found a home: "We disagreed. We still admire the risk." And then a small kindness. The skeptic who'd killed 3 flashy effects in a row emailed the postdoc a preprint on phase-correlated flows that supported a narrow part of her claim. The subject line read, "You were early." She read it on a bus, put her forehead against the window, and laughed out loud. Then she opened her laptop and added a slide: "Credit where it hurts." Meaning showed up in the work, not the wins. Science felt less like a duel and more like a negotiation with reality, refereed by time. People lost seminars and found collaborators. Results shrank and got better. The field learned to write its courage into pre-registrations and its doubts into methods. And after years of push and pull, one quiet email would tilt the balance with 5 words: "It's there. Check your model." The crisis moment, a pattern that predicts before the data arrives. The email landed at 4:12 a.m. subject line: "It's there." No figures, no adjectives, just a location tag for a Euclid tile that hadn't been public when the model was trained. The postdoc stared, thumbed a reply, "Don't joke," and got back a second line: "Coordinates match. Mass too." The room she was in didn't move, but inside the field something shifted. Rewind 3 months to the pre-registration everyone thought was reckless. The team had turned their analogy into a forecast engine. Take a filament network built from older surveys and simulations. Compute multi-scale controllability, how easily small, localized perturbations at a junction steer state changes across modules. Cross that with spectral slope corridors that had stayed stable under distance-preserving nulls. Out popped a shortlist: junctions likely to be high-gain hubs, including one in a sky tile Euclid would map next. They timestamped the list, hashed it, and sent the hash to a neutral party. No hedging. Meanwhile, they layered the physics. The candidate hub wasn't just a point, it was a regime. The model predicted 3 observables: a lensing detectable mass concentration at a redshift slice where earlier catalogs were thin, a specific arrangement of 3 bridges feeding it, 2 thick, 1 marginal, and a velocity shear pattern along the thickest bridge, measurable if Roman or Euclid spectroscopy landed. On top of that, a time domain nudge. If a merger had hit the upstream node in the past few hundred million years, downstream galaxies in the marginal bridge should show suppressed star formation with a predictable lag. Critics lined up their questions. How did the model avoid learning survey edges? Why wouldn't it just nominate every high-density region as controllable? The team's answer was mechanical, not rhetorical. The engine penalized degree-only solutions. It favored betweenness under spatial constraints, bridges that shorten paths across modules, and controllability that rose when you simulated localized shocks and tracked transfer entropy along spines. It had failed on purpose in blinded tests where high density lacked bridging. It passed when bridging existed without obvious density peaks. They published those failures alongside the bets. Then Euclid released a sliver of the sky with shape catalogs and photometric redshifts. The tile with their hashtagged coordinates sat there, quiet, a postage stamp in a sea of stamps. A collaborator in the Euclid team who'd agreed to check after release ran a fast lensing reconstruction and stacked the area. A mass bump appeared at the predicted redshift slice, modest but above the noise. Two clear filament ridges converged. A third, thinner path ghosted in at the edge of significance. The collaborator didn't add color. He didn't have to. The team didn't sprint to Twitter. They did what they'd promised. They opened the pre-registration, unblinded the coordinates and motifs, and posted the match alongside every control. Shuffle bridge nulls, edge-preserving randomizations, mask-aware resamples. The probability that a random location with similar environment would mimic the same hub plus bridge's signature dropped under 1% with the declared tests. Not discovery-level proof, prediction-level teeth. Skeptics took a breath and sharpened knives the right way. Could the lensing peak be projection? Two smaller structures stacked along the line of sight. The team reran the photometric redshift slicing with stricter cuts. The peak persisted. Could the bridges be artifacts of the filament finder on a noisy mass map? They tried a second skeletonization algorithm and got the same spines within the declared tolerance. A third check asked the worst question. Did the model, somewhere in its training diet, see any hint of this tile? They showed the provenance chain, no. The tile wasn't in earlier catalogs at the needed depth. The hash timestamp stood between them and self-deception. Then came the harder part, flow. Roman wasn't up yet, but Euclid's slitless spectroscopy provided coarse redshifts with limited precision. Within those limits, the velocity field along the thickest bridge showed the predicted shear sign, consistent with inflow toward the hub. Not clean enough to stand alone, clean enough to be uncomfortable if you'd bet on metaphor only. The team flagged it as tentative and waited for deeper spectra. One swallow doesn't make a summer. Everyone said it out loud. A single hit can be luck, bias, or a fluke of masks, but psychology doesn't wait for 5 sigma. The prediction had reached into the future and pulled out a coordinate. The conversation shifted from are they seeing faces in clouds to how many tiles before we call it. The group published a list of 10 more hubs with the same locked-in protocol. They invited rivals to register their own lists with different models. If the effect was real, it shouldn't belong to one lab. Privately, the skeptic who'd built the placebo spine test wrote the line he'd sworn he'd never write. "I'm still not sold, but this is the first time I'm nervous." He proposed an adversarial replication. Pick regions where the model predicts nothing special and test whether postdictions creep in after the fact. The team agreed. They also agreed to let an external committee handle the masks and cuts for the next round. No secret knobs. In the weeks that followed, small signals accumulated. SCA Pathfinder polarization catalogs showed a marginal increase in Faraday rotation coherence along the thick bridge during a window when X-ray stacks hinted at hotter gas. LSST wasn't yet deep in cadence, but archival variability maps suggested a mild dip in star formation proxies downstream of a known upstream event, timing compatible with a shock travel model. None of it clinched the case. All of it leaned toward the same shape. The postdoc who'd screenshotted spectra months earlier walked home after midnight and realized the boundary had moved. The field still argued. It should. But a pattern had predicted before the data arrived, and the sky didn't contradict it. If the web can forecast itself at the mesoscale, then we're not just naming bones. We're listening to channels. Which raises a question that's less cosmic and more personal. If the network carries influence, where does that leave the signals we send as one of its smallest parts? You are here, agency, identity, and responsibility if we're neurons. So where does that leave us if the web carries influence and we live inside it? Start small. Agency isn't a cosmic broadcast, it's a local push that still matters. A neuron doesn't decide the organism's goals, but its spikes shape what happens next in its neighborhood. Same with us. Our actions nudge flows, information, money, energy through channels we can actually touch. That's compatibilism in practice, real choice inside larger dynamics. Identity shifts too. In a brain, most cells aren't hubs. They're specialists that keep the system honest, sensing, relaying, stabilizing, cleaning up. Meaning doesn't come from centrality, it comes from contribution. If the web has high-gain bridges and quiet backroads, most of us live far from the glamorous junctions. That isn't failure. Systems collapse when small nodes stop showing up. Responsibility follows from that map. If influence travels through networks, then lying, flooding, and rage bait are like pathological signaling, noise that jams integration. Ethics becomes network hygiene. Protect low-noise channels, strengthen honest feedback, damp runaway loops. That sounds abstract until you notice how easily feedback spirals spin society's brittle. Incentives tuned for clicks, algorithms amplifying outrage, bad actors exploiting delay lines. Brains avoid seizure by balancing excitation and inhibition. Healthy communities do something similar. Norms and institutions act like inhibitory control that prevents one rhythm from locking the whole system. Get this, the timescale mismatch doesn't let us off the hook. Cosmic lags are glacial. Ours are. We live on edges where fast loops matter, markets, media, science itself. The earlier tests, pre-registrations, pipeline transfer functions, adversarial nulls, are just network hygiene written into method. Those same habits scale to civic life. Show your work, commit to rules before results, audit the pipes that carry signal. There's a quieter identity shift hanging in the background. If we're components, it's tempting to shrink. Don't. Components inside living networks create new functions by coupling, collaboration, not isolation. Rich clubs in brains integrate specialized modules. Open science networks integrate labs. When we chose to pre-register risky predictions and invite rivals to attack them, we acted like a system trying to increase its integrated information without boiling over. That's a tangible way to think better as a species without reaching for cosmic consciousness. What about free will? Inside constraints, choice is still choice. The weather sets the wind, the pilot still flies the plane. You can't rewire the cosmic web, but you can rewire your corner, habits, institutions, incentives. Agency becomes fractal, small but recursively amplified when it lands on high-betweenness bridges. Most of us won't sit on those, but we can feed them with cleaner signal and refuse to amplify noise when they stumble. Meaning gets simpler. You're not here to be the hub. You're here to keep your lane honest and help good lanes connect. That's not resignation, it's leverage. A neuron that times a single spike right can prevent a seizure or start a memory. A team that writes one careful method can save others from a year of self-deception. Scale that across millions of nodes and you get a network that learns. One last turn. If the skeleton can forecast itself, we don't gain destiny, we gain duty. Pick practices that raise clarity and lower brittleness. Teach people to read pipelines, not just plots. Reward corrections, not just first claims. Build bridges across modules that don't agree, because disagreement with rules is computation. Outrage without rules is noise. We won't feel the universe think. That's fine. We can still decide what kind of signal we are. And on human timescales, that's the only consciousness that asks anything of us. Time, scale, and the problem of feeling. There's a stubborn snag we keep circling: speed. Brains bind a world in a few hundred milliseconds. The cosmic web turns a page in tens of millions of years. If consciousness needs fast, recurrent loops, how could anything that's slow ever feel like anything? That's the timescale objection in one line. One way around it is coarse graining. Systems with slow parts can still produce an effective present by integrating over long windows. Trees signal through chemical waves and mycorrhizal networks over hours. Forests remember droughts across seasons. Ecosystems shift regimes over decades and still show feedback, hysteresis, and recovery. The subjective time of a forest isn't our time, but it isn't zero. It's a stitched present made of snapshots. Could the web have something like that? An awareness measured in eons, not seconds. You can define an effective integration window, the time over which filaments exchange enough mass, heat, and magnetic energy to measurably change each other's state. In some simulations, that window's a few 100 million years for a bridge, for supercluster walls longer. Within those windows, vorticity pulses, shocks, and phase correlations travel and interact. If you stretch the definition of present to fit, you get a slow, recurrent system with loops that close far outside any creature's lifetime. But here's the catch we can't hand-wave. The known theories that try to pin experience, integrated information, global workspace, recurrent processing, weren't designed for glacial loops. They tie feeling to rapid ignition to feedback that binds many specialized processes in something like real time. If you coarse-grain too much, you risk counting any long-lived structure as aware. Rivers coordinate flows. Plate tectonics has feedbacks. Are they feeling? Most scientists draw the line before that. So take the safer route. Keep 3 tiers separate. The web has structure. It almost certainly runs computation in the strict sense. Directed predictive power where past here helps forecast future there beyond shared history. Experience, as in what it's like from the inside, remains unproven and given the speed limit, unlikely in any familiar way. That's not cynicism, it's discipline. We can test computation. We can't test qualia on billion-year timescales. There's still room for insight without overreach. Coarse-grained consciousness might be too slow to notice, but coarse-grained agency is. Feedback that shapes the web, AGN outflows, cluster weather, magnetized shocks, forms loops that change what later flows can do. Those loops don't feel, but they do remember. They write history into structure. At that level, the universe looks less like a still life and more like a ledger, past influence accumulated as potentials, fields, and channels. You can also flip the question. If the web can't feel, why do we? Because speed buys options. Brains compress worlds into milliseconds, letting loops close before the world moves on. That suggests a hierarchy. The cosmos provides slow scaffolds and gradients. Stars and planets provide middle tempos. Biology squeezes time until it can build selves. There's no insult in that. It's division of labor across scales. And yet, here's a workable proposal for meaning that doesn't depend on cosmic feelings. Judge systems by computability you can detect and by the integrity of their loops. A healthy brain keeps excitation and inhibition in balance, raises integration without seizing. A healthy scientific network does the same. Fast feedback, honest error correction, slow structural changes guided by evidence. If the cosmic web has an analog, it shows up as resilient channels that transmit influence without collapsing into noise. That's a standard we can actually measure. Controllability rising where structure supports efficient, stable propagation, dropping where brittle paths shatter under stress. If you want a poetic comfort, take it carefully. Maybe the universe's awareness, if it exists, would be glacial, epics as thoughts, superclusters as syllables, but we don't need that to keep going. The computability claims stand on their own. Shocks travel, phases align, vorticity pulses steer accretion angles, predictive hubs show up where models said they would. The skeleton isn't inert, it carries influence. So we leave the consciousness claim open and unforced. The honest answer is, probably no, not in any way we'd recognize, and we can't test the rest. The strong, testable claim stays on the table. The universe computes through a web whose channels and gates we can map, perturb, and predict. Which brings us back to the room that went quiet. The night a pattern predicted before the data arrived, and the sky didn't contradict it. Resolution and broader meaning. In the end, the maps didn't just resemble each other. One of them started answering a question, on schedule in the sky. If you want to see whether the next Euclid and SCA tiles cement the claim or break it, watch the sequel next week. Subscribe so you don't miss the replications, the adversarial tests, and the lab that's risking its reputation on a forecast.